These 5 little books from the 1960s just became one of my favorite fantasy series I have ever read. And today, it is my hope to take you on a journey as I deep dive into what I loved so much about these books in hopes that maybe I convince you to read them as well. So grab a snack, grab a drink, put on your comfiest pair of pants, and hang out with me for a while we discuss The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Now, last week, I decided to sit down and read the Book of Three, which is the first book in the Chronicles of Prydain. My reasoning for reading this kind of came from 2 different places. I've actually owned the box set for a while, so it felt like a good opportunity to read the books I already own. I'm always talking about shelf control and reading the books you already own, not going and buying more books. Well, I have owned that box set for a hot minute. I originally bought it because The Chronicles of Prydain is actually what the Disney animated movie, The Black Cauldron, is based on. Technically, the movie is really based on the first 2 books of the series. Kind of takes a little bit from both of those books, but I bought the box set because I wanted to know more. I've been a Black Cauldron fan for a long time, and I kind of wanted to see the origin of all of that. But that was a while back, so flash forward to this past year, I've been doing a series where I've been going through 80s dark fantasy, both books and movies, and kind of reading, watching, discussing them, critically analyzing them. A book series that kept coming up in my comments because at the end of each of these videos, I would say, let me know if there's something from this time period that you think I should read or watch. And something that kept coming up time and time again, every single video, was The Chronicles of Prydain. The only problem was that when I started to look into these books, a couple of things arose. One is that they are essentially like middle grade YA, kind of in that age range, which is fine. I read a lot of middle grade and I read a lot of YA, but I kind of have to be in the mood for it. And I just didn't know that I was in the mood for something like that. And also, I really question how dark of dark fantasy could a series that is really aimed at younger adults or middle grade be? And my goodness, I shouldn't have asked that question because I was shown just what counted for dark middle grade in the 1960s. It is much darker than a lot of the things that come out for middle grade today. But even with all of those comments, I sort of put the series off for quite a while. And this was for a couple of reasons, but probably the biggest one was that the series was written in the 1960s. And to me, that didn't feel like it was meant to be in the discussion of 1980s dark fantasy. But oh, how wrong I was, because not only does this fit within that discussion really beautifully, but in many ways, I feel like this book and also the book Elric of Manibene kind of feel like the dawn of this dark fantasy vibe and aesthetic that we started to get in, the 60s, but really expanded on in the 70s. And then by the 80s, we were getting things like The Dark Crystal and The Neverending Story and Excalibur and Legend and stories like this. But a lot of them have quite a few roots in the Chronicles of Prydain, which is interesting because I think the Chronicles of Prydain also has a lot of roots in The Lord of the Rings. So finally listening to what my commenters wanted, I decided to sit down and read the Book of Three and quickly progress from one book to the other until after about a week, I had read all 5 books. I flew through these. I loved them so much. I needed to know what happened and where the story was going. And I'm very happy to say that this is one of those series that from beginning to end really, really delivers. We will be discussing this much more later on in the video, but it has a really satisfying ending. It has really fantastic characters that you get to know and love. And it's got an absolutely beautiful and captivating world. And no matter how much I was given about this world, I always wanted more. So my hope with this video is that I will convince you to read or reread the Chronicles of Prydain. And bearing that in mind, I plan to not give you too many spoilers. Now, I will be discussing some important plot points of each of the books, but I'm going to try and keep the information I give you sort of generally what you might expect when you read the back of the book. So I'm going to give you a little bit about what the story is about, what the focus is, and give you some key elements. But at no point am I going to ruin the ending for you of any of these books. At no point am I going to ruin the twists for you. I really want to convince you to fall in love with this series if you haven't read it already. And I think that spoiling the whole plot for you, it wouldn't do that. It would have the opposite effect. So while I can't promise no spoilers, there's going to be very few spoilers in this video. And at the end of the day, it's 5 books. I couldn't give you every single plot point. I guess I could, but it would be a very long video. And I don't have time for that. I don't think you have time for that. So I won't be giving you every single plot point of these books. And so with that baseline kind of set, let's jump in. First and foremost, I think it's important to know a little bit about the author, Lloyd Alexander. Now, Lloyd Chudley Alexander, what a middle name that is, was born on January 30th, 1924. And I do want to point out, I think this is very important. My birthday is January 31st. His birthday is January 30th. So it makes a lot of sense that we have very similar vibes when it comes to fantasy stories. It makes a lot of sense that what I'm looking for in a fantasy story, he would deliver because our birthdays are so close. Now, Lloyd grew up in Pennsylvania during the Great Depression, and during that time, he developed a passion for reading books and writing poetry. Lloyd ended up going to college, but only for 1 term. And after that time, he was like, you know what? I've seen what I needed to see. I've done what I needed to do. There is nothing that this is going to teach me that I can't just learn out in the real world. So instead of going to college, he enlisted in the United States Army. army. And eventually he ended up working in intelligence and counterintelligence, which I think is really interesting. And he actually met his wife while he was stationed in France and studying French poetry, which I think is really beautiful. Upon coming back to the United States with his new family, he really wanted to make it as a writer, but he really struggled to make a living writing books until the publication of the book And Let the Credit Go, which came out in 1955 and essentially was like autobiographical. This was actually still 11 years before he would publish the first book in the Chronicles of Prydain. The Book of Three, which is the first book, came out in 1964. And basically these books were written as like a love letter to his passion for Welsh mythology. Lloyd Alexander basically formed this love of Welsh mythology during World War II. He was really inspired by the language and the castles and the scenery of Wales. Obviously, I also think he was very inspired to write a story that had a lot of action and combat in it from the fact that he was doing combat intelligence during the war. And so eventually he planned to write the first book in the series, which was initially called The Battle of the Trees, a book which we now know as The Book of Three. As I mentioned before, The Book of Three came out in 1964. And in the book, we follow Taran, who is a young boy in his like mid-early teens. Taran lives with his mentor, Dalbin. And Dalbin is a 379-year-old enchanter. Together, they also live with an old and retired warrior named Cole and a magical white pig named Henwin. Henwin is described as an oracular pig, which basically means that she is able to like make divinations and see the future and like make prophecies. And Taran is basically her keeper. So throughout the story, he is referred to as Taran, Assistant Pig Keeper, because that is his job. So no matter where he goes on these grand adventures, doing things with knights and all sorts of other grand stories that he goes on, everybody sort of always refers to him as an Assistant Pig Keeper because that's his job. That's his career, basically. The story really kicks off when he loses Henwin into the forest and he runs after her. And this is sort of the inciting incident that gets the whole adventure rolling. In the forest, he runs into Prince Gwydion, who is the son of the High Prince of Prydain. Gwydion was essentially on the way to Caer Dalbin because he wanted to consult Henwin, the oracular pig, in order to get some information about some prophecies. But now the pig is lost and they've got to work together to try and find her. Now during this time, they also meet a really interesting character who I think is like probably the most lovable character of the book, named Gurgi. Gurgi is interesting because he's essentially a creature who is like part man, part beast. He is sort of like living on his own, always hungry, kind of like scraping by. And the best way I can describe him to you is he's sort of like a combination of like Gollum from The Lord of the Rings mixed with Sam from The Lord of the Rings. So I want you to just like imagine that type of character. Now, if you've seen the animated movie, you have a pretty good idea of what this character is like, because though the animated movie does take a lot of liberties with the storytelling and kind of the direction these characters go and how the plot points kind of meet up within the story, they do get the characters fairly right. When I was reading this whole series, it was very easy for me to imagine the Gurgi from the movie specifically, because he has that is how he talks, that is how he sounds, that is how he acts within this story. And though he kind of meets them at this point where he is almost like begging for food and kind of like just like a weird creature out in the woods, he is incredibly lovable. He became one of my favorite characters in the story. I think he's a character that is very easy to love. He's so innocent but kind of pitiful. You kind of just want to hug him. Like, he's a really wonderful character. Now eventually this group of characters is captured by these undead warriors called the Cauldron Born. And these undead warriors are pretty important to the entire saga of the Chronicles of Prydain. They essentially are the servants of the Horned King, and the Horned King himself is a servant of Aran, who is the Lord of Death. So they like ran into the woods to find a pig, and already they're mixed up in some really dark dealings. Now throughout the story of the Book of Three, we also meet three other characters that are pretty important to the story. One is of course Princess Elanwi. Now Princess Elanwi is a princess from a family of enchanters. She carries with her a magical bauble that's like this glass orb that is able to light up, and her and Taran's relationship throughout the 5 books is really interesting because when they meet, they're both very young and they're very childish, and they kind of like pick on each other a lot. And it's interesting to see these two characters. They end up working together, they end up becoming friends, but oftentimes they're sort of like testing each other's boundaries. They're sort of like picking on each other, and oftentimes one will upset the other and vice versa. And it's interesting because when we start this story, we really see them as children, and throughout the story, we really get to see both of them mature, which I think is really rewarding as a reader. There are times in the Book of Three and even in the Black Cauldron where I found myself kind of annoyed with the two of them because they do act very childish. But that childish action and the way that they are kind of snippy towards each other and the way that they kind of get on each other's nerves is all in service of a grander story of eventually watching them grow up and grow old and come to just really care about each other. And that is so important to this tale that as I got further into the story, I sort of forgave their younger selves for being the way they were, because that immaturity becomes so important to this story of watching the characters that they eventually become. And the characters they become, you wouldn't feel so much towards them. You wouldn't be like, wow, they've really come so far if you didn't see them at the beginning of that journey being really, really immature and childish. The other thing I love about Princess Eilonwy is that she loves a good simile, okay? She is always comparing things. So I want to read you some quotes. These are some examples. "I'm not sure I'm going to help you anymore at all. After the way you've behaved and calling me those horrid names, that's like putting caterpillars in somebody's hair. I don't like being called a girl or this girl as if I didn't have a name at all. It's like having your head put in a sack. If you don't listen to what somebody tells you, it's like putting your fingers in your ears and jumping down a well. I can't stand people who say, I told you so. That's worse than somebody coming up and eating your dinner before you have a chance to sit down." And on she goes. Like, she just has so many of these really interesting comparisons. And I want to mention something that makes the characters of this book really interesting and really stand out, and you always know which character is talking, is because they all have these really interesting mannerisms. Like, each character can really easily be identified on page without you having, even if the author never said this character spoke, that character said this, you would almost always know who is speaking because they all have these really interesting ways of talking. Gurgi, of course, most famously is often going on about like munchings and crunchings and things like that, which has like a really cute sound to it. And then there's the other character we meet in the Book of Three, which becomes a really important character, named Fleur de Flamme. Now, Fleur de Flamme is a king by birth who chose to be a bard, though he's not particularly good at it. And Fleur de Flamme also has a bad tendency to stretch the facts. He doesn't have a very good relationship with the truth, which becomes very funny because he has a harp. The strings break anytime he tells a lie. So throughout the story, sometimes he will say something like, "We have to go into battle. A flamme never shies away from battle." And then a string will break. And there are other times where he'll be like skirting the truth a little bit, and the strings will like pull tight like they're going to break, and then he like kind of corrects himself. And so this harp is sort of trying to teach him to be more honest throughout the entire story, which is really interesting. And the other really important character that we meet in the Book of Three is a character named Doli. Now, Doli is one of the fair folk, and essentially in this world, the fair folk live in this magical kingdom that is underneath the surface of Prydain and sort of like spans the entire underworld of Prydain. If you've ever played The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom, you kind of can imagine what this looks like. You basically have this whole overworld where a lot of the characters are living. But that underworld in Tears of the Kingdom is pretty like dark and scary, but just imagine that, but with like lots of like glowing crystals, really magical. All of the fair folk are basically living underneath there, sort of like within the hills and under the ground, and they have their own whole society that like spans the entire land of Prydain. Doli is described as a dwarf, and in the Book of Three, he is described as one of his only kin who does not have the ability to turn invisible, and it's something that he wants more than anything, to be able to turn invisible. But we kind of get the sense that the reason he wants to be able to turn invisible is that he doesn't really like people very much. He's kind of antisocial, so he kind of wants to turn invisible just so he can like get away from people a little bit. Something that's interesting about each of these books is they all sort of function as standalone. Now, do I recommend reading them as standalones out of order? Absolutely not, because there are things introduced in each book that bleed into the others. And especially when you get to the last book, I think it's incredibly important that you've read the other four in the series. However, each of them has a really distinct three-act beginning, middle, and end. And I think that's another thing that I really loved about these. I've talked a lot about how something I cannot stand, when it's a trilogy, I can kind of get behind the second book of the trilogy having like a big cliffhanger into the third book. I can get behind that, okay? But what I see a lot, especially in today's middle grade and YA, is that the first book even does not have a full 3 acts. It has an act 1, an act 2, and then in order to know what happens next, you have to continue reading the next book. And for me, that just doesn't work. I need the first book in any series to have a complete beginning, middle, end story. Does that mean that it can't leave threads unwound so that we can go into other stories, so that we can go into the next book? Does it mean it can't have a cliffhanger? Absolutely not. But many of these books, it's not even that they don't tie up their loose ends, it's that they don't tie up anything. They don't have an ending. And I think it's really important to have an ending in your first book of some kind, because that also helps build trust with your reader. If I read your first book and you cannot adequately create some form of ending within that first book, it does not give me much faith that you're going to be able to create a satisfying ending 3, 4, 5, 6 books from now. Like, I need to know that you can tell a cohesive story from beginning to end before I'm willing to sit down and go on this journey for you. Now, I know that's not true for all readers. Some readers are totally fine with having those loose ends, having that open-ended story end of a first book going into a series. But for me, I really appreciated that every single book in these 5 books had a really clear beginning, middle, and end. And then when we went into the next book, there were things that, of course, bled over and things that became more important later on in the story. But that was fine with me, because then I was like, oh, that's really cool that there's more to this thing. There's more to this place. There's more to this character. I didn't ever feel like information was being withheld from me so that I could get a better book later. And I think that's kind of what that feels like sometimes, is that I can't have a great beginning, middle, end story in book one because the author is holding back to give me something really great later, but I want them to give me as much as they can right now. And Lloyd Alexander does a really great job of that. Every story feels epic and a thing of its own that also is part of this much bigger tale. So upon finishing the book of 3, I will say that my true love of this series did not really begin until book 3, and I was not sold as this being like one of my favorite fantasy stories that I'd ever read until book 4. So that's also really interesting. Now, I should mention, I did not think that book 1, 2, and 3 were bad by any stretch of the imagination, but I did think that they were good. They weren't great to me, they were good. And there are a couple things that play into that, especially when you read the first and second book. There's a lot here that's going to feel kind of derivative. In fact, when the book of 3 came out, it was criticized by reviewers for being too derivative to things like The Lord of the Rings. When I finished reading the book of 3, I remember thinking, because at the time I thought I was going to make a review for each book, and then I felt like, oh, they're just so short. I want to read the whole series before I talk about any of it, and so that's what I ended up doing. But had I made that initial review, and something I think I would still maybe say, is that the Chronicles of Prydain, if fantasy books were family trees, the Chronicles of Prydain is sort of like the weird, quirky, like niece or nephew to The Lord of the Rings. So there's a lot of things in this book that clearly feel very similar to things in Lord of the Rings, right? Like we have an old wizard type character. We have a character who sort of is not really anybody special, who kind of gets tied up in this big overarching fantasy story. We have Gurgi, who really, like I said, takes elements of characters like Gollum, but also characters like the loyalty of Sam. You know, we have these elements that feel very Lord of the Rings-esque as you start to read. You're like, well, I feel like I've seen this a little bit before. And that does get better as the story goes on, but especially in the book of 3 and in the second book, The Black Cauldron, which we'll talk about in a second, you really do see things that are heavily influencing this story. Now, if this book felt derivative in the 1960s, you can only imagine how derivative it feels reading it in 2025, because you have an even longer breadth of fantasy literature to look on. And so I will tell you, when you read the book of 3, it's going to feel a little been there, done that, okay? It definitely has every element. There's not much special in this book outside of the characters. I think the characters and the way they interact, and even though this is a really dark, kind of scary story, there's a lot of humor between the characters and the way they interact. And, you know, Flute of Flam and his harp breaking when he lies, and Gurgi looking for munching and crunchings, and Taran and Elanweek sort of bickering. There's a lot of levity to this darker story. And I think that is something that really stands out here as being special. When I was looking up this book, there's also like, it was criticized for that humor. They were like, it's too funny, which I thought was really, really funny. That was a criticism. That whoever read it was like, there's too much laughter in this book. I just imagine that reviewer is like not a very happy person. Thought that was really funny. But, you know, reading it now, it's going to feel even more derivative, especially if you've read a lot of fantasy books. You're going to feel like everything in this book I've kind of seen before. But that is why you sort of have to keep reading. And the good news here is, listen, I've talked about this before. I hate when people are like, just keep reading. It gets great. By book 7, it's so good. And I'm going to tell you to do that a little bit as well, with 2 caveats. One is that book 1 is not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't show the full potential of what this series can be and what it becomes. It's just like a good book. It's not a great book. And number 2 is that the first book is so short. Okay, to give you some perspective, I listened to these on audiobook as well as like kind of reading through them on paper as well. The audiobooks for like the first 4 books are like 4 to 5 hours long. Like there's a reason I was able to read this whole series in a week. You can speed through these. So even though you are going to commit a little bit to getting into this series, the time investment of reading like 2 or 3 books before it really gets your claws in is still not as long as reading some of these long books where people are like, give it 5 books and then it gets really good. That 5 books long to get to one really good book. Here we're talking about like page length wise, we're talking about like a half a book to get to when it really gets good. Okay, let's put it all in perspective. The other thing that's interesting is that so much of the Disney animated film, The Black Cauldron, is actually based on the Book of 3. There are a couple important elements that are based on the Black Cauldron, specifically the cauldron itself and the name come from the second book, The Black Cauldron. But also what comes in the Black Cauldron are the 3 witches, which becomes a really important part of the story as well. I also think it's kind of fine that they ended up calling the movie The Black Cauldron. So the Book of 3 is essentially this book that Dalbin owns. It has a bunch of secrets and information and magic, and it's kind of like his spell book. We don't really get to see what's inside it. We just know that it's got a lot of information. It's got a lot of secrets, okay? but I wouldn't actually say that it's like the most important element of the first book. I feel like the first book could have been called like The Chase for Henwin, or like meeting Elanwi. I don't know. There's like so many more important things that are happening. And the Book of Three becomes really important to the story, but not really until like the very last book. So I think it's interesting that the first book is called the Book of Three. It is important. It's an important artifact in this world, but it is not nearly as important in the first book as some of the other things, including the Black Cauldron. I think the Black Cauldron really is like one of the most important elements of the first and the second book. So it makes sense that Disney would name their movie after the Black Cauldron, because to name it the Book of Three would be weird, because you'd see it in like the opening scenes and then you wouldn't really talk about it that much more afterwards. People would be like, why is this called the Book of Three? Like, they wouldn't even remember it existed by the end of the movie, I feel like. But that is a really great segue to get into book 2, which is called The Black Cauldron. And The Black Cauldron came out in 1965. And it takes place a little over a year after the events of the Book of Three. And essentially, Prince Gwydion has called a bunch of allies to a council that is being hosted by Dalbin. Though at the end of the first book, they do have this pretty great victory, now things are starting to get bad again. Men are going missing, there are more and more Cauldron-born showing up, and all that means that Aran, the Lord of the Land of Death, is basically getting more and more followers, which is like not the best. So Taran and all of these companions, they basically set out on this mission to essentially find and destroy the Black Cauldron, which is the thing that the forces of evil are using to create these Cauldron-born, which are kind of like undead zombie warriors. Along this journey, and really along every journey of this book, they meet a bunch of different characters. So we're constantly kind of meeting new characters and having these little story moments within this bigger tale. And I am not going to recount to you all of those right now because, like I said, I don't want to spoil things for you. And also because I think meeting all of these characters is a really fun part of the story. Every one of these books introduces some quirky new characters. The way they talk is very quirky. The way they interact with these characters is very interesting. And each of them has an important role to play in the story. So discovering them along the journey is really fun and really rewarding. But the most important characters that we meet in this book are the three witches. These witches live in the marshes of Morba, and when we come upon them, they're basically like threatening to turn our heroes into frogs. But as time goes on and they have this discussion, basically Taran is forced to give up something really important to himself in order for them to give him the Black Cauldron. And a lot of the story really revolves around that moment. Now, I will say, of all of 5 of the books, the second book, The Black Cauldron, really feels like an extension of the first. It really feels like it's kind of like cleaning up loose ends from what happened in book 1. Because though there is like a pretty big victory at the end of book 1, book 2 is really like kind of cleaning up that mess, like going after the Black Cauldron itself, which is causing a lot of these problems. Whereas book 1 is really more about dealing with the Horned King, who is the one sort of leading this army of undead. The Black Cauldron is more about going to the source and trying to kind of stem this flow of undead warriors, which is causing this whole land of Prydain so many problems. In this book, we also start to get more glimpses of the Fairfolk and what their part in this whole world is. And we're also introduced to these 3 witches, and they become pretty important to the story as well, but they do kind of play the role of the Fates in like Greek mythology and things like that. So meeting them, they never are characters that are like taking an active role in the story as much. They're sort of kind of giving us some direction and kind of pushing characters in certain ways. And they're also kind of characters that are sort of like always in the background. So if you've ever watched or read any story involving the Fates, that's kind of what you can expect from these 3 witches. Probably the most notable thing you need to know about with the Black Cauldron, though, is that it did win a Newbery Honor in 1966. So at this point, the book is really starting to gain some traction, and this series is really starting to gain some respect in the reading community. Like, people are starting to read it and talk about how good it is. I think it's interesting. I talked about all of the reasons that I think it's great that this is probably the better title for the movie, The Black Cauldron, partially because it's covering these 2 books. I think it's a pretty excellent name, but I think this is actually the book that moves our characters forward the least, with the exception that I do think Taran really starts to see just how in over his head he is. Like, this is the moment where he really starts to see just how serious all of this is. In the first book, we see that he really wants to be a warrior. He's a kid. He's a young boy. Like, to him, it's all a game. Like, I want to learn how to sword fight. I want to be the greatest warrior in the land. I want to, right? In book 2, we see him lose someone important to him for the first time, and we sort of see him start to see the gravity of everything and start to take all of this a little bit more seriously and realize that this isn't just all fun and games. And that is like an important first step for him in his road to maturity. This series really is about Taran growing up, and that is like that first moment. Like, the first book, yes, we're seeing him realize that, his responsibility is important. He thinks it's I am an assistant pig keeper. What a boring job. But in the first book, we really see like why that's important. And we start to kind of see him build this found family of friends around him. I also want to mention, and this is a great time to point this out, that at this point in the story, we have no idea who Taran's parentage is. So he's living with these two kind of parental figures in the woods, one being an old wizard, another being an ex-warrior. But he doesn't know who his parents are. He doesn't know where he comes from. So he's kind of a nobody. And this story is also a story about him kind of figuring out who he is in this world, which is an important element of maturity as well. So while book one is sort of about him starting to take his job as an assistant pig keeper seriously and take that aspect of his life seriously, book two really shows him the danger of this world, that this is not a game, that being a warrior has consequences, and going into these battles is dangerous. And we really start to see that. And we also see him kind of have to give up something important to him. We see him have to make a choice to give up something that he really loves and that he really cares about in order to do something big for the greater good. And that itself is also incredibly important to this story as a whole and kind of ties into the ending of the entire story, which I won't give away to you, but that moment is probably the most important thing that happens in this book. Other than that, this book is probably the least progress all of our other characters make story-wise. It's sort of, like I said, just serves to fill in almost like an ending, like a second piece of the first book. In fact, the first two books, the Book of Three and the Black Cauldron, could easily have been a duology. They kind of couple together as a pair of books really, really well. But all of that brings us to book three. And book three is when this series kind of started to like get a grip on my heart. This isn't the book that made me think like, oh, this is one of the best things I've ever read, but it is the book that made me think, wait a minute, I think I like this more than I thought I was going to like this. This is the book where this series started to become more than just like a good fantasy series to me and started to become something special. So book three is called The Castle of Llyr, and this book comes out in 1966. It's crazy how quickly these books were coming out like one after another. I think that's just wild that he was writing these prolific pieces of fantasy literature, albeit they're short books, but so quickly one after another. Now, what I like about The Castle of Llyr is that it has a slightly different structure. So the first two books, we kind of like get our band of adventurers together and we go on an adventure. And The Castle of Llyr is the first time where we kind of split the party up a little bit. Castle of Llyr takes place 18 months after the end of the Black Cauldron. And we start out the story with Elanwi, who is of the House of Llyr, and she is basically encouraged to go to the royal court, which is on the Isle of Mona, so that she can start continuing her education to become like a lady of the court. They essentially want to turn her into a proper princess. What I love about her as a character is that she is very girly. Like, she is that diva, okay? Like, she is very girly. She has a lot of girly sensibilities, but she is always one of the first people, like when they're like, we're going on an adventure, grab your swords. Elanwi is like already at the door with weapon in hand. Like, she is a fighter, and she is ready to get into the muck and the grime, and she is like ready to go to battle for her people and for her friends and for her family. She is such a brave, courageous character, and I love that she's so feminine in her characterization, but she also is such a warrior. Like, she is such a fighter, and I love that about her. And the boys are always like, no, it's too dangerous, you can't come, and she's like, I'm coming. Like, I'm going on this adventure, and who are you to stop me? I'm a princess. I get to do what I want, right? Like, she uses the princess privilege, but as a means to like get herself into the battle. And I love that about her so much. Like, she's such a phenomenal character. And what's interesting is when I was reading the first book, I remember thinking like, oh, she's like a little obnoxious. Like, she's kind of like always complaining to Taran, and she does have these moments where she's, if that's the way you're going to be, I'm not talking to you. Right? And she's very like hands on hips, like that kind of character. But as the story progresses, and I just saw how constantly brave and constantly courageous, like constantly one of the first people that's like, okay, there's a fight. Let's go. Get in the car. We're going. I came to love her so much. She might be my favorite character in this series. I really loved her, and I really loved how bold she was, but I also just really loved that at the end of the day, she is a princess, but she's using her royal status to like get her way, but for the best causes possible. And I think that's really, really cool to see in a character. And I think that really stands out to me because now that I've read so much 80s dark fantasy, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that women in those stories, in a lot of them, not all, but in a lot of them, are really written terribly. In many of those books, especially the adult ones, the women are just there to be almost like a plaything for the men in those stories. They aren't these bold characters. Even the characters that are like queens or like running things, they're showing up in like skimpy lingerie, and they're basically just there as like something for these men to like get off on as they go on their adventure. And so to have a character from the 60s who is this young woman who is just so bold and so adventurous and so ready to jump in with all the other boys, I just loved her so much. She reminds me a lot of Alana, which I read the Alana books last year and I absolutely loved them. And she kind of has that vibe as well. Like you could totally see her dressing up as a boy to go to battle, which she kind of a little bit does in these stories. And so it was great to see another character like that. Like Elanwy is just fantastic. One of the best characters in this series. So back to the story. She is asked to go and like complete her princess training. And so she goes and she is accompanied by Taran, who is basically like going with her to make sure that she gets to the castle safely. And what I think is really interesting about this book, so up until this point, Taran and Elanwy are friends, okay? They're friends. They're going on these adventures together. They're kind of like kids, and they're kind of like getting on each other's nerves, picking on each other, and being bratty towards each other. But you can tell they really care about each other. And book 3, The Castle of Llyr, is the first time where you start to realize, oh, these two like each other. They have feelings for each other. And this becomes really apparent because when she gets to the castle, she is introduced to Prince Rune. Taran finds out that there's kind of hopes that she will eventually marry Prince Rune. And Taran immediately is like, I don't like that. And I have a funny feeling in my tummy that makes me not like that Elanwy is possibly going to be with another boy. What's going on? What's this feeling? What is this feeling so sudden and new? Like it kind of has that vibe to it where he's like, I don't know. And the thing is, obviously, he's like, well, obviously she's not going to marry me because I'm nobody. Like, I'm an assistant pig keeper. She's a princess. She can't marry me. Like, that's not going to happen. But also, I don't really want to accept that she's going to marry him. He knows in his heart that he can't be the one to marry her, but he also doesn't love the fact that he now is being faced with that, with this Prince Rune character. And Prince Rune is like such a nice guy. I mean, he's not like very brave and he's not much of a warrior. And when he shows up, I mentioned every character kind of has these like linguistic traits of how they talk. He's always like, hello, hello. He's such a jolly little kind of fool. And so I think that especially plays into it, is like Taran at this point feels like he has kind of become a little bit of a hero, like a little bit of a warrior. And now he's being introduced to this prince that might get the girl. And he's just such a little kind of bumbly kind of fool. Right? And I think he's a little bit like, oh God, this is the guy that the girl that I like is going to be with. Like, I think he's even more annoyed by that fact. But while they're at this castle, unfortunately, it turns out the Princess Elanwy is kidnapped. And now Taran and Rune together, along with some other companions, are going to have to set out to try and rescue her. And what's interesting about this book is that Elanwy ends up not being like a central character in this book. Like, obviously, she is a character. Her whole going to become more of a princess and then getting kidnapped is like the inciting incident that kind of gets this book rolling. However, she's kind of off page for a lot of it. But even so, in this book, we end up learning quite a bit more about her and her heritage and her magic and kind of just where she comes from and who she is. And it's really interesting to start to get that backstory about her with her being off page for so much of the book. I thought that was kind of interesting. And I think what was great about that is that it kind of gave these other characters a moment to get to know more about her. And in learning more about her and the fact that she is kind of absent from the team for the first time, we also start to see how important she is to each and every one of them and how important she is to kind of this found family as a whole. And not having her there is the best way to show what is missed when she is not a part of the group. And I kind of love that. Now, I will say there are things that I absolutely love about this book. I was sad that Elanwy is like not on page for most of it because I just love her so much, but she's there enough that we still get like that Elanwy fun. Also in this book, Flam ends up befriending, I guess befriending is the right word, a giant cat. Her name is Leon, and she is a cat that becomes larger than a horse because of a growth potion. There's like a whole element of these potions in the third book, and Flam ends up befriending it. It kind of becomes his pet. And we also meet a giant in the third book that also has become giant because of these potions. So a lot of this like plays into kind of the deeper story of book 3, which again, not going to tell you everything here because I want you to read the books and experience and enjoy these characters. But I couldn't do an entire video about the Chronicles of Prydain and not talk about this giant cat because I was obsessed. And I don't remember if it happens in book 3 or book 4, but Flam essentially starts riding the cat. It's like his mount in the story. So if you could just like imagine, like all the other characters are like clopping along on their horses and Flam is there on a giant fluffy orange cat. And I love that so much. And I will say, as not important to the overall plot as it is, there was this moment where there was a giant orange cat and Flam had become friends with it and he was going to ride this cat. And I was like, oh, I love this. And it's weird because there's so many good things about this series and there's so many good characters, but it's weird to say that that was the moment. Like, that was the moment where the thumbs up became a heart. Like, the like went to love for this series. But it kind of was, because it's so fun and it's kind of silly and it's kind of ridiculous. But even though the Chronicles of Prydain is a darker fantasy story, like, there's some scary things here. There's some dark elements. There's some evil villains. It still is a world where a character who has a lie detecting harp can ride atop a giant cat, and that makes perfect sense within this world. And I kind of love that. I love that duality of this story, that at times it is really dark and scary, and there's crumbling, dark, terrifying castles, and there's undead warriors, but also there's a bard on a cat. I love that it has that mixture of elements in this story. It is also kind of a moment where this story starts to feel like something of its own. Early on in the books, I talked about how it can feel very derivative. This third book and moments like this giant who drank a growth potion, this giant cat that ends up being a bard's mount, these are moments where the story starts to really take on a life of its own. It's almost like up until this point, the book has kind of been leaning on stories like The Lord of the Rings and other early fantasy, and those are kind of like helping it along. If you can imagine, like, a toddler is like learning to walk because its parents are kind of like holding it up. And this third book is sort of like where the parents let go, the training wheels come off, and the toddler just starts like charging. Like, that is the feeling you get from this third book, is like the training wheels are off, we are moving forward, and this has become something really special on its own. And I love that for this third book. But that feeling that I was beginning to love this series really was taken to another level with book 4. The book 4 is called Taran Wanderer, and this came out in 1967. This is easily my favorite book of all 5 of them. It is really special. This is a really special book. I'm only going to tell you a little bit of what happens in this book, just like I've done with the other stories here. But just know that this one is the one where I fell in love. This is the book where I fell in love with Prydain. This was the one. Taran Wanderer takes place 3 years after the Castle of Llyr. And I think that's important because at this point, we've started with Taran as a really young, kind of middle teens character, and we have grown up with him. And now we have gotten to this point where he has recognized he is in love with Elanwy. Okay, like, he knows that now. But he is really afraid of the fact that he cannot marry her because he is of common birth. He's a nobody. He's an assistant pig keeper. So he has this idea that if he goes out into the world and finds his parentage, he wants to go on a quest to figure out where he came from, who his parents are, because if he can do that, there's a chance that somewhere in his lineage, somewhere in his blood is royal blood, and then he will have the ammunition he needs to be able to marry the love of his life. And there's a couple things I love about this. The Black Cauldron series, I think, is a series that is great for young men and young women and everyone in between. I think it is a book that will appeal to young people, to adults of any gender. And that's really special because so much of young adult and middle grade fantasy is geared very specifically towards young boys or young girls, especially in like the way that it's marketed, the way the covers are done, the way the stories are told. And sometimes it is what it is. Like, we could go into a whole conversation about that. But I think that this series specifically is really catered to just young people. And obviously adults can really enjoy this, but I think a lot of the lessons and a lot of the deeper meanings here and the important stories are for young people. I think that's important to mention. But what I love is that we follow a story in book 4 about a character who is a young boy who is so in love that he is going to go on a quest to try and find proof that he is deserving of the girl he loves. And it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And what ends up transpiring, he ends up going on this quest, and the only character he brings with him is Gurgi. So the whole story is really just the two of them going out on a quest and seeing what they can find. The first place he ends up going, he ends up visiting the 3 witches, and he says, help point me. And so they end up kind of giving him some direction and kind of leading him to where they think he can go. And it's pretty far away. So he is going on this like really far-flung quest, further than he's really gone out before. And this book has this really solitary feel. So yes, he's with Gurgi, but a lot of our other characters are completely absent. Like, Elanwy is not there. We see some of the other characters along the journey for sure, But this is a solo story for Taran. This is really a story of him going out and figuring out who he is and kind of maturing. And there are also some dark things happening. There's an evil presence that is kind of harassing the fair folk, and a lot of this is building towards the climactic events of the fifth and final book. But all of that is sort of happening off to the side, like in the sidelines. And sometimes Taran's story encounters it, like comes into the mix, but it's almost like this other story is happening, and just every once in a while, Taran like guest stars in it, right? As he's on his own journey. And specifically later in the book, he ends up trying to learn a bunch of various skills. So as the story goes on, he'll learn something that he thinks is sort of about his parentage, but then it will turn out to be like a false start. And so eventually he realizes, well, I'm not who I was before. I'm not this assistant pig keeper anymore. He starts to go by the name Taran Wanderer because he's just wandering, kind of trying to find his way in the world. So he ends up trying like several different skills, like pottery, swordsmithing, and like weaving. And when he goes to each of these people that are teachers, he's like, can you teach me? And so they'll start to teach him. And as he learns these skills, he's also learning really important things about himself, about who he is, and about the kind of person he wants to be, and who he's growing into, and what really matters to him as a person and as an individual. And it really does have this very philosophical kind of storytelling vibe. Like everything has a deeper meaning. At this point, we have left the childish bickering of book one behind, and we are now in a story where everything has depth. Every line of dialogue, every moment that he encounters is lending towards him figuring out how to be an adult, and him figuring out how to be the person he is going to be, but also him figuring out, like, what are his morals? What does he stand for? What matters to him? What does he care about? And what is he willing to do for those things? Like, what does it mean to care about things? What does it mean to have these morals? And seeing a character kind of go through that journey and figure out all of these things for himself is really special. It's awe-inspiring. There are books that, because of the lessons that they teach and the deeper meanings, I think you walk away from them feeling as if you've learned something, feeling as if you've grown a little bit as a person, feeling as perhaps like reading this book made you a better person, gave you some things to think about. I think so many people, when they're trying to become better at their career or they're trying to work on themselves, when they go to read, they lean into self-help books. And I'm not saying that's like the wrong course, but I think books like this prove that you can learn things about yourself, that you can grow as a person, that you can find some really moments of peace and moments of beauty and moments of self-discovery within fiction, within fantasy fiction, within genre fiction. And I think that's really special. Anytime going forward that anyone talks about, we see these people a lot on, I'm sure they're here on BookTube, on Book Talk, where they're like, genre fiction is shallow and there's no depth and it's all trash. It's all blah. Like there was a guy, he might still be out there today. I don't know. There's a guy a while back who his whole thing was he was just like Stitch and Duet creators who were talking about fantasy or sci-fi and just trash on them for reading genre fiction. Am I telling you should never read nonfiction or anything like that? Absolutely not. I think nonfiction, I think classics, I think all forms of books have something special and something important that we can learn from. But all that to say that includes fantasy. And I think this is a great example of a book where you walk away feeling like not only has the character grown, but you as the reader have grown because you read it. And I can only imagine how powerful this book would be for any young person of any gender identity. Reading this book could walk away from this and really learn something, could really grow from it. And I think that's really amazing. So this book is definitely more than the sum of its parts. And this book takes a character from childhood into adulthood. Like this book is the bridge that gets Taran from being that goofy, silly little kid who's bickering with Elanwi to being an adult and being the person that we need him to be going into book 5. So after this long journey, we finally get to the end. So the final book in the Chronicles of Prydain, with the exception, I'm going to talk about one other kind of novella type thing after this, but really the final book in the story is The High King, which came out in 1968. Kind of something that's really interesting to me is that all the other books take place like a year or more. In the case of Taran Wanderer, 3 years after the previous book. This book takes place days after the end of Taran Wanderer. Like he goes out on his adventure, he learns about himself, he grows as a person, and he comes back and we are like in full gear for the ending of this story. He gets home and he finds out that Elanwi has returned from the Isle of Mona, where she has been learning to be a princess. The Isle is now ruled by King Rune, who was once Prince rune. So he has now ascended the throne. And at this point, he's like ready to tell Elanmi that he loves her. Like there's one moment where he's like, I need to talk to you. But then, of course, all hell breaks loose and he doesn't get to tell her. The servants of Aran, who we talked about before, is the Lord of the Land of Death, assault the warrior Gwydion, and they seize this magical black sword, which is like an important part of the entire story, which I haven't even mentioned because to me, these like artifacts and these like important elements of the story, like this magical sword Dyrnwyn, all of that is like really important. And it's stuff that I am excited for you to kind of discover on your own. But to me, the stories that are really powerful here and the things that I walked away from the book loving the most were the characters and their growth and watching them become the people they become. So anyway, there's this sword that's really important from the first book, from Book of 3, called The Sword of Dyrnwyn. And basically, the sword is very important and kind of is a little bit like the ring from The Lord of the Rings. Whoever holds it is going to have a lot of power. And basically, Aran's forces have attacked Gwydion and they have seized the sword because up until this point, Gwydion was the one who was like holding it. Now, Taran and his forces basically have to join together and they have to go out and they have to try and stop this sword from getting back to Aran, because if they do that, he's going to have the ability to bring even more Cauldronborn to really like flood the land and take over. And we've kind of like hit that final battle moment. This book is phenomenal. It is also the one I'm going to tell you the least about for obvious reasons. It's the final book in the series and it is full of twists and turns and story elements that are just like, oh my God, what is happening? But what I am going to talk to you about is some of the feelings of reading it and some of the important aspects of it that really stand out to me in the most non-spoiler way possible. So forgive me for being a little vague, but I want you to read this series and be shocked and awed by the end. So I'm doing it for you. First and foremost, there are two really important things I need you to know about Book 5, about the High King. So the first is that every single solitary character, from the most important like Taran and Elanwi and Flutaflam and Dolly, for every important character that we've met so far, you are going to see again in this book. Also, every minor on page for like a chapter or less character that we've met so far in the Chronicles of Prydain is going to be in this book and they're going to have a moment. Every single character. No one's left out, at least not that I could think of. And I really kind of like tried to keep a running tab. Like as soon as I realized this was happening, that like characters from the Book of 3 were coming back, characters from the Black Cauldron were coming back, characters that were like so minor were like showing up to do like one or two little things and then like bounce off screen. As soon as I started noticing this, I really started to try and keep track of it all. And there's not a single character that, at least characters that are alive by Book 5, okay, that didn't show up. They're all here. And they all have an important part to play. Every one of these characters, it's not just like a cameo. I mean, some of them, I guess, are a little cameo-esque. But even so, every one of them has a reason to be there. And I cannot imagine the story as it is existing without them. Every one of these characters, even the minor ones who show up to do like one thing, that one thing is incredibly pivotal and important to the plot. And so seeing these characters come back in droves makes every single aspect from Book 1 to Book 4 feel incredibly important, because now all of it is kind of twisting together into this final book. Like I said, no stone is left unturned. There's a character from Book 1 that is so minuscule, like such a not really important character that does like one thing. It would have been so easy to leave them out of the story, and they still managed to make an appearance in this book. And I think that is so cool, because every chapter you're reading and you're like, oh my God, what is going to happen? Like, who is going to show up next? Who's next? Who's next? It kind of has that like Marvel movie cameo vibe, except a lot of times in Marvel movies, I do feel like those cameos, a lot of times they're just there, right? It's like you'll see, Wolverine sitting at the bar drinking. Here, all of those characters, what they contribute to this final story is really important and is really vital. Now, to that end, this is both a blessing and a curse. And the reason it's a curse is because the 5th book does not hold back in killing off characters. And so we frequently, not just once, frequently in this book have characters who are sometimes those minor characters who are just returning for a quick moment. And others are like characters who have been important to this series since the beginning, do not make it out of this book alive. And I was a mess reading this book. And I think early on, when the first of these characters that was like kind of important, but kind of not, died in battle, alarm bells started going off in my head, because I was like, well, if that character isn't safe, no one is safe. And I was right. No one is safe. And listen, plenty of characters make it out alive of this book, but there are a lot of characters that don't. And all of the ones that we lost, I was so upset about. Like, there was not a single one where I was like, okay, that's fine. It's okay. Every single one, I was like, oh no, we lost another one. Because you come to care so much about every citizen of this world. Even some of the villains, even some of the characters that are villains in previous books come back and are trying to help do the right thing. And then when we lose those characters, it still feels like a punch to the gut. You're just like, oh my God, we're losing all the best ones. It really creates a sense of danger. As you progress through the story, I became more and more scared. I was like, oh my God, if they kill this character, I'm going to lose it. I'm not going to be able to finish the book. There are a couple characters I knew were safe. Okay. Like, let's be real. There's a couple like main characters that I was like, they're safe. But there are a couple of like main-ish characters that I loved that I was like, I don't know if they're safe. I don't know if they are. And if they die, I'm not going to be able to handle it and I'm going to lose my mind. And so I'm just like gripping the pages like, what's going to happen? I couldn't put it down. I needed to make sure everyone was safe. And I knew if I stopped reading, they wouldn't be. You know what I mean? I knew if I put the book down, if I stopped reading the book, if I put the pages down, the characters would not be okay. And I love that this book made me feel that way. So I say all of that. And I sound like a crazy person to say that feeling of dread, because we are in a final battle. We are in a war for the land of Prydain. It should feel dangerous. It should feel like anyone can go at any point. It should feel like if we make it out, it's going to be a miracle. It should feel that way, and it does. And it means that the ending of this book, when we finally get to those final pages, the final pages again are heart-wrenching. I'm not going to obviously tell you the ending of the book, but there are many aspects of it that remind me of the end of The Lord of the Rings in this bittersweet, like happy, beautifully happy, but tragically sad at the same time kind of ending that Lord of the Rings has. It has that ending to it, like that feeling where you're just like, it's so good, but it's so sad and it's bittersweet, but it's perfect. Like the ending is perfect. I can't imagine the series ending any other way. And I cried a lot. For me, that's the mark of a great book. Like if a book can make me cry that much over these silly little characters, that in the beginning I was just like, oh my God, these are just like bratty little kids being mean to each other. And now I'm just like, oh my God, I love them so much. That was really impressive to me. I have read so many books, and I've read single books that had really disappointing ending. I've read full series that had really disappointing ending. I think this book has a perfect ending. I would not have ended it any other way. Like the way it ends is exactly the way it's supposed to end, and it's stunning and it's beautiful, and you leave off the last page so badly wanting more, but knowing that it's over it's just it's so good. It's so good. Now, I want to mention the great thing is that when you do finish the book, there is a little bit more. So there is this very short book. It's called The Foundling and Other Tales of Prydain. Every chapter is a short story about Prydain, and it gives us a little bit more information. Some standouts, especially coming off the very end of book 5, we get a story about young Dalbin and like how Dalbin came to be Dalbin and how he got the Book of 3. By the end of book 5, we find out some really important things. We find out some really important elements about the world as a whole. We find out a lot of our answers about Taran and who he is. And we also find out what the Book of 3, what that whole thing is. Like, what is that book? That's why I said with book 1, it's kind of weird that it's called the Book of 3, because we don't really understand its full purpose, the full breadth of what it is, until the end. And in one of these short stories, we get to see how Dalbin, as a kid, came into possession of the book and how he found it and like how he got to be where he is today. And I loved that. I thought it was like it's very short and sweet, but it's like a really great little bit of extra information to kind of give you some more context for who he is and like what his part in this whole story is. That one I think was one of my favorites of this too, because Dalbin and the Book of 3 have some really cool and important moments in book 5 that really resonated and also like kind of open this world and kind of give you a lot of answers in like a very short amount of time. And so seeing just a little bit more of that was great. We also, there's a short story about Elanwi's parents and kind of like how they met. That's really cute, especially because it sort of shows Elanwi kind of where she gets her attitude and her spirit. Like you kind of see where that comes from. So that was a lot of fun. There's a short story about the magical sword Dernwyn and kind of its origins as well. There's also a story about Flute of Flam and like how he got his harp, which I thought was great. And there's a story about Kull, the retired warrior who also lives with Dalbin and Taran. Like a story about him and Henwyn specifically, a little tale about him. This story I think is especially lovely because it just shows what a great character he is. He is a character that you will come to love a lot, but he's not not actually on page all that often, which I think is really interesting. He's a character that you really grow like a huge fondness for, but you actually don't see him all that often. So the fact that you come to love him so much, I think is actually very impressive from a writing standpoint, because we actually don't know very much about him, but we love him. And so it was great to get a little bit more about him. And it's almost like this confirmation. He is such a side character for most of the story, but this short story is this confirmation that he really is just like such a good guy. I loved it. I think there are different versions of this short story collection, The Foundling, but in the one that I read, this was the last of the stories, and it was in every way the perfect way for me to say goodbye to the Chronicles of Prydain. Like, it felt like such a perfect place for my journey with this story to end. I'm really grateful that it was the last story in that collection. It felt like that's where it belonged. Like, it felt that story alone gave me this little bit of closure that I needed to finally be like, okay, I can step away from this now. My cup is full. You know what I mean? I really loved it. I would say that that short story and The Foundling, which is the title of the short story collection, that is the one that is about Dalbin and kind of him as a baby, like becoming who he becomes. Those two were my favorites, but every single short story here is fantastic. There's not a single one I would have left out. They're all really interesting, and they all provide just like a little bit more backstory to Prydain in really fun ways. So coming away from this series, I think at this point, if you haven't already guessed, I mean, I think I said at the beginning, this has become one of my favorite fantasy series that I've ever read. I'm hesitant to put it up there with The Lord of the Rings. I do think The Lord of the Rings is maybe more of just like a pure feat of writing. Like The Lord of the Rings is something truly just the amount of depth in that series is crazy. But I do think that this series could mean as much to me possibly at some point as those books. The reason I can't put it on that same plane just yet is that I have reread The Lord of the Rings a lot. I've been reading them since I was a little kid. I am a huge fan of that series, but The Chronicles of Prydain has all the things that I love about The Lord of the Rings, and it has them in a way that I think is actually much more readable and much more digestible. As much as I love The Lord of the Rings, I think those books can be a lot. I think for people that are just getting into fantasy, I think sometimes they feel like they have to start with The Lord of the Rings, and then they get into it and they're just like, their head is a little frazzled because it's like, this character is the son of this character, who is the son of that character. And it's a lot. Like, there is a lot to that book. Like, at times, reading The Lord of the Rings can feel like reading a history book, and they can be kind of dry. Like, yes, there are phenomenal characters in The Lord of the Rings. There are incredible moments. There are moments that'll make you cry. There are moments where you'll be celebrating the victories of the characters, but they can feel a little heavy. And I think what I love about the Chronicles of Prydain is if anyone of any age was like, I really want to try reading fantasy, I would happily put this series into their hand. They are short and readable. They are fun. They also have some dark and scary to them. They have fantastic characters. And those characters, every single one of them, has a beautiful arc of growth where we get to see them go from being kind of inexperienced and silly and kind of just like meandering around doing whatever, and seeing them grow into characters who are really loyal, really have a lot of honor and integrity, and watching them become these really incredible people. And seeing that character growth is just astounding. And so this is a series that I think anyone can read and enjoy. I love that they're so short too. I think sometimes people get put off by fantasy because so many fantasy books are like big, giant tomes. Listen, I love a long book. I do. I love a long like series that you can just like sink your teeth and your time into. But there's something really special about being able to read a 5-book series with a very complete and epic storyline filled with really complete and epic character arcs, and being able to read all of that in like such a short span of time because they're so quick and digestible and easy to read. I also think this would be a great series for like parents to read with their kids because I think there's just so much here to talk about. I think there are so many really great lessons. Lloyd Alexander was actually criticized with his books. Critics felt he was too heavy-handed with the lessons and the themes. But I actually love the heavy-handedness with the lessons and themes, especially because these are for young people. Like, I think young people should walk away from these books and feel like, oh, I learned something from this, right? Like, when kids watch shows like, Bluey or whatever they're watching, I think it's great that there are things out there that exist that are just like pure fun and chaos. But I also think it's great that there are things out there that exist that you can learn something from, that you can find something of yourself within, that you can walk away from and feel like you grew in some way. And that is very much this series. Like, there are so many fun things to talk about here. And I think parents and kids could read this together and have a lot to discuss. But also, I think just adults could read this and really enjoy it. And it's very fun and it's very quick. I'm kind of astounded by how much depth there is in each of these books, considering how short they are. Like, I would read one and I'd basically read one in a day, but there was so much story there, right? I think about when I was reading The Wheel of Time. First of all, I'm not going to dig on The Wheel of Time because I do like The Wheel of Time, even though I haven't read the entire series yet. Each of those books, you read it, and it's 600 to 800 pages. And as you're reading it, you feel like nothing is happening. And then you get to the end and you're like, wow, quite a bit actually happened. Like, there actually was quite a journey in that book, but as you're reading them, because of the slower pace, it feels like nothing is really ever happening. Then you get to the end and you're like, oh, wow, so much happened. These books, because they're so short, something is always happening. Like, there is always something happening on page. So then there are moments, like the first time that they meet with the three witches, the story like grinds to a halt as they have this like really long back and forth conversation with these witches. And it almost feels out of place a little bit in this story that is like constantly moving. Like, the pace of these books never lets up. So there are moments that are quieter where they slow everything down to like really have these like conversations and really have these moments. And you realize just how important those moments are because they are the only time where the story is not moving at this like crazy fast pace. So I think being able to enjoy such an epic, grand adventure in so few pages is really phenomenal. And I think it speaks volumes to the skill of Lloyd Alexander as a writer. Listen, I think there's something to be said for long books. I think there's something to be said for short books, but I think I will always be impressed by authors who can give me an epic grand adventure in 150 pages. I will always find that a little bit more impressive than someone who can give me an epic grand adventure in 600 to 1,000 pages. In 600 to 1,000 pages, you better be giving me an epic grand adventure. You better be taking me on a journey, right? Like, it's expected at that many pages, but it's such short page counts. To be able to go on such a journey in such a short amount of time feels very impressive and really speaks to just the writing quality of what we're seeing here. And also, we're not just getting like flat out plot. Like, in that short amount of time, we're also getting some really brilliant characters and really captivating character growth. Obviously, I could go on and on and on and on, but I'm going to bring us to a close. I loved the Chronicles of Prydain. This is a 5 out of 5 series for me. So the Book of 3, the Black Cauldron, and the Castle of Llyr, I gave all of those 4 out of 5. And then Taran Wanderer and the High King, I gave 5 out of 5. But if I had to give a rating to the entire series, it would be a 5 out of 5. Just so incredible from start to finish. Every little aspect of this story has payoff in the final book, which I think is just incredible. I don't know how he managed to bring every single character and element back into that book and have it mean something even greater than we thought it did, but he does it, and it's really incredible. It's so amazing. I can't say enough good things about it. I probably used the word incredible 85 times in this video. It's just that good. It deserves those 85 incredibles. So a couple of questions before we go. Have you ever read the Chronicles of Prydain, and what did you think? Is there another series that you think I would enjoy since I liked this so much? I do think I'm going to be reading more Lloyd Alexander. I really like his writing, and I found out that he has written a ton of books, something like 45, 46, something like that books. And so I want to read more of them. So I've ordered a couple more, and I think they're all like pretty quick reads. But is there another series that you would love to see me do a read through and then some kind of wrap up about? This is the first time I've really done a series wrap like this, like a deep dive on a series. So I'm curious. I'd love to know if you enjoyed this video and if you'd like to see more. And on that note, this is YouTube, so I'm going to ask you the normal YouTube things, which is that if you did enjoy this, please drop a like, leave a comment, let me know what you thought. If you've read these, if you like them, if you've never read these, if I've convinced you to read them, let me know all of those things. Those really help me know if you are enjoying these videos and if you enjoyed watching it and if you'd like to see more. And obviously, subscribe if you can. That also helps quite a bit. I'm so curious to hear your thoughts on the Chronicles of Prydain. I would love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments about these books and what has been your experience with them. I can't wait to hear all of that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, happy reading.